Most leaders think they have a time management problem, but what they actually have is a capacity problem because no calendar system can compensate for cognitive exhaustion. Before we begin, if you're a leader who wants to protect your decision quality, energy, and long-term performance, everything I referenced today is linked in the show notes. You'll find the executive capacity audit, the waitlist for the Strategic Longevity Collective, and the link to book an executive longevity strategy call. If you're a leader who is ready to engineer your recovery, protect your energy, and stabilize your physiology, you're in the right place. Welcome to Longevity Unlocked. I'm Sherrie Austin, registered nurse and executive longevity advisor, and this podcast is for leaders who refuse to trade their health, clarity, or decision quality for success. Because here's the truth most leadership conversations miss. Performance is biological. Your ability to think strategically, regulate stress, and make high-stake decisions is directly shaped by sleep, metabolic health, recovery, and nervous system stability. But in modern leadership culture, capacity erosion often happens quietly. Nothing appears broken, yet decision quality slowly declines. Clarity fades. Energy becomes inconsistent. And over time, leaders begin operating far below the level their potential actually allows. This podcast exists to change all of that. Each episode explores the physiology of leadership performance, how sleep, stress, nutrition, movement, and recovery shape cognitive capacity, emotional regulation, and long-term resilience. Because sustainable leadership isn't about pushing harder. It's about protecting the biological systems that make high performance possible. If you're a leader who knows there's more available, more clarity, more energy, and greater strategic depth, you're in the right place. Let's unlock it. Let's talk about how productivity culture has misdiagnosed the problem. The argument is not that productivity tools are inherently bad. That's modern productivity culture often attempts to solve a physiological and cognitive capacity problem with organizational tactics alone. The issue is not that leaders lack systems. The issue is that exhausted nervous systems are being asked to sustain strategic performance indefinitely. For years, we've been taught that if performance declines, the answer is better optimization, another app, planner, scheduling strategy, morning routine, and productivity hack. But what if the problem was never time management to begin with? What if the real issue is that leaders are trying to operate at elite cognitive levels while physiologically depleted? Modern performance culture promotes hacks instead of sustainable infrastructure. We've normalized the idea that peak performance can be engineered through shortcuts like biohacks, cold plunges, supplements, 5 a.m. routines, dopamine manipulation, and endless morning optimization rituals. I do a lot of these, and they are great. The hacks are temporary amplifiers. They are not substitutes for foundational capacity. You cannot continuously override exhaustion with stimulation and expect long-term strategic clarity. A leader can use caffeine to push through fatigue for a quarter, but eventually the nervous system collects the debt. And when it does, the first thing to decline is rarely productivity. It's judgment. Hacks help people survive overload temporarily. Infrastructure helps people sustain excellence consistently. Optimization culture has turned humans into machines to maximize output. We have entered an era where every moment has become something to optimize: sleep scores, step counts, calendar efficiency, response speed, output metrics, personal branding, and constant visibility. The underlying assumption has become, I'll optimize enough. If I optimize enough, I can outperform human limitations. But the body does not negotiate with chronic stress indefinitely. Optimization without recovery becomes sophisticated self-destruction. Many executives are incredibly optimized externally while internally dysregulated. They are usually struggling with elevated cortisol, fragmented sleep, decision fatigue, emotional reactivity, reduced pattern recognition, and constant low-grade cognitive overload. From the outside, they appear high-performing. Internally, capacity is eroding. High functioning is not the same thing as high capacity. Let's talk about the scheduling obsession. This is still a challenge for me and other leaders I know. Executives began managing calendars more aggressively while ignoring cognitive load. We have become obsessed with time blocking, calendar architecture, maximizing efficiency, and squeezing productivity from every hour. But calendar systems cannot compensate for a depleted brain. A perfectly optimized calendar cannot restore strategic thinking if the nervous system never exits survival mode. A leader may protect meetings with precision while never protecting recovery windows, deep thinking space, or cognitive decompression. So the calendar looks efficient, but decision quality quietly deteriorates. The problem isn't that leaders don't manage time. The problem is they don't manage capacity. Technology has increased organization, but fragmentation is often intensified. We were promised that productivity apps would create more control. Instead, many leaders have become permanently cognitively connected. Notifications, Slack messages, emails, dashboards, texts, calendar alerts, and team communication platforms, all competing for attention simultaneously. The brain was never designed for perpetual context switching. Every interruption creates cognitive residue, and over time, that fragmentation reduces our focus, working memory, strategic patience, and emotional regulation. Many leaders are not failing because they lack discipline. They are operating inside systems that continuously fracture attention. And this is where productivity culture misdiagnosed the problem. The issue was never simply organization. The issue was capacity, because every decision, strategy, conversation, and leadership interaction flows through human cognition, and cognition is biological. You cannot optimize your way out of physiological depletion. At some point, leadership performance stops being a productivity problem and becomes a recovery infrastructure problem. Most productivity strategies assume the brain and body are functioning at baseline capacity. They also assume the issue is organization, discipline, time management, or motivation. But when physiology is unstable, the problem is not productivity. The problem is biological capacity. You cannot consistently optimize output from a nervous system operating in survival mode. This is why high-performing people often say, I'm doing all the right things. I'm using the planner, I'm following the system. I still feel overwhelmed, foggy, exhausted, or behind. And I know, because I was one of those people. The issue is that physiology always precedes performance. And here's how that breaks down. Number one, sleep deprivation. The brain cannot strategize from exhaustion. Sleep is not passive rest. Sleep is neurological maintenance. During deep sleep and REM sleep, memory consolidates, emotional processing occurs, metabolic waste clears from the brain, hormones regulate, executive function restores, reaction time improves, learning integrates, and impulse control stabilizes. When sleep is impaired, the prefrontal cortex, that's the part of the brain responsible for planning, prioritization, and emotional regulation, strategic thinking, judgment, and impulse control starts functioning less efficiently. Meanwhile, the amygdala, the threat detection, emotional reactivity center of the brain, becomes more activated. The result is small problems feel massive, concentration decreases, emotional reactivity increases, attention fragments, simple decisions feel exhausting, procrastination increases, motivation drops, and recovery capacity declines. This is why sleep-deprived people often mistake physiological depletion for laziness, lack of discipline, drive, or just falling off. When in reality, The brain is conserving energy because it perceives the instability. A productivity app cannot override a sleep-deprived nervous system. Number 2 is cortisol overload. The body is staying in survival mode. Cortisol is not bad. It is a survival hormone. It helps mobilize energy, increases your alertness, responds to danger, regulate blood sugar, and maintain wakefulness. The problem occurs when cortisol remains chronically elevated. Modern life creates continuous micro threats: financial stress, nonstop notifications, emotional conflict, overwork, poor recovery, social comparison, inflammatory diets, excessive caffeine, insufficient sleep, and constant urgency. The nervous system begins adapting to chronic activation instead of cycling between stress, recovery, and restoration. Leaders stay trapped in stress, and partial exhaustion. This creates hypervigilance, racing thoughts, shallow sleep, increased abdominal fat storage, blood sugar dysregulation, anxiety, irritability, decreased creativity, lowered frustration tolerance, and reduced cognitive flexibility. Chronically elevated cortisol also reduces access to higher order thinking. The brain prioritizes survive the moment instead of strategize for the future. That is why people under chronic stress often react instead of reflect. They stay busy, but they're ineffective. They confuse urgency with importance and overwork with meaningful progress. So from the outside, it looks like poor productivity, but physiologically, it is chronic nervous system activation. Number 3, decision fatigue. Cognitive capacity is finite. Every decision consumes metabolic energy. The brain is constantly processing choices, emotions, social dynamics, risk assessment, uncertainty, and environmental stimuli. When physiology is unstable, cognitive reserves shrink dramatically. Sleep deprivation plus stress plus elevated cortisol equals accelerated mental fatigue. This leads to decision fatigue. Decision fatigue is the progressive decline in decision quality after prolonged cognitive demand. Some signs of decision fatigue include avoidance, impulsive choices, indecisiveness, reduced willpower, emotional eating, doom scrolling, procrastination, difficulty prioritizing, and mental paralysis. People often assume, I need more discipline, but discipline itself requires neurological resources. Executive function is biologically expensive. When the brain is overloaded, it shifts toward energy conservation. This is why exhausted people know what to do and what not to do, but still struggle to execute consistently. The issue is not knowledge. The issue is depleted cognitive bandwidth. Number 4, chronic stress. The body was never designed for endless activation. Humans evolved for intermittent stress, not perpetual stimulation. Acute stress can enhance performance temporarily, but chronic stress degrades your immune function, hormone balance, digestion, sleep quality, metabolic health, emotional regulation, memory, attention span, and recovery capacity. When the nervous system loses flexibility, people become stuck in fight and flight and freeze or functional shutdown. Many high achievers normalize this state because they remain externally productive, but internally, they feel emotionally flat, disconnected, exhausted, mentally foggy, reactive, and uninspired. And I know I've been there. Many leaders that I know have been there. It's not a great feeling. Over time, chronic stress reduces strategic thinking, creativity, resilience, emotional intelligence, and long-term planning ability. This is why many executives, entrepreneurs, healthcare workers, and caregivers eventually experience burnout, identity fatigue, emotional numbness, and reduced capacity despite high effort. The body eventually forces what the mind ignores. All right, let's pivot for a moment and let's talk about why traditional productivity advice fails. Most productivity culture focuses on scheduling, optimization hacks, routines, efficiency, and time management systems. But physiology determines whether those systems are sustainable. You cannot outplan nervous system dysregulation, outdiscipline hormonal exhaustion, outorganize sleep deprivation, outhack chronic inflammation, or outwork depleted recovery systems. When physiology is unstable, the brain shifts from creation to protection. The person may still appear functional externally while internally operating at dramatically reduced capacity. This is why recovery is not laziness. It is infrastructure. The real solution is recovery as strategic infrastructure. High performance is not built through constant exertion, but it is built through oscillation. We have stress, then we recover, we have adaptation, and then growth. Sustainable productivity requires sleep architecture, metabolic stability, nervous system regulation, movement, sunlight, emotional processing, boundaries, deep recovery, cognitive rest, and strategic thinking time. The highest performers are not necessarily the people doing the most. They are often the people protecting their cognitive clarity, emotional regulation, decision quality, recovery capacity, and physiological stability. Because every decision flows through human biology first. Performance is downstream from physiology. Let's discuss decision quality as a leadership asset. Most leadership conversations focus on revenue growth, operational efficiency, scaling, execution systems, productivity, and profitability. And those things matter, but there is a hidden variable underneath all of it that almost nobody discusses: the physiological condition of the decision maker, because leadership is ultimately not a productivity role, it is a decision-making role. Every hire, firing, partnership, acquisition, negotiation, strategic pivot, communication, cultural tone, crisis response, investment, and innovative decision flows through human cognition first. That means the quality of the organization is often downstream from the quality of executive decision-making, and decision-making is directly affected by physiological capacity. Let's pivot the conversation. Let's discuss decision quality as strategic capacity. Most leaders understand the importance of protecting revenue, reputation, operational systems, cybersecurity infrastructure, investor confidence, and intellectual property. But very few leaders intentionally protect cognition, clarity, executive function, nervous system regulation, recovery capacity, and mental bandwidth. Yet, those are the systems producing every major decision. That's the contradiction. An organization spends millions protecting servers, data, logistics, and legal infrastructure while the CEO is operating on fragmented sleep, elevated cortisol, chronic stress, emotional exhaustion, constant interruptions, and decision overload. In other words, the organization protects the machine, but neglects the operator. Leadership is ultimately a decision-making role. This is the core reframe. Leadership is not primarily about being busy, accessible, attending meetings, responding quickly, and working long hours. Leadership is the ability to interpret reality accurately, filter signal from noise, remain strategic under pressure, and make high-quality decisions consistently. That requires cognitive clarity. When physiology deteriorates, decision quality deteriorates. And because leaders influence entire organizations, the consequences compound. One exhausted leader can create cultural instability, operational confusion, financial loss, unnecessary urgency, poor hiring decisions, reactive communication, and strategic drift. Not because they lack intelligence, but because their capacity is narrowed. I'm going to give you some examples of reaction versus strategy. When the nervous system is regulated, leaders can pause, assess, prioritize, think long-term, tolerate ambiguity, evaluate trade-offs, and remain emotionally neutral under stress. This creates strategic leadership. But under chronic physiological strain, the brain shifts into survival prioritization mode. The leader becomes increasingly reactive instead of strategic. The reactions are immediate, emotional, urgency-driven, short-term, defensive, and impulsive, while strategy is deliberate, thoughtful, long-range, regulated, selective, and patient. A dysregulated nervous system struggles to sustain strategy because the brain perceives continuous threat. The body keeps asking what needs immediate attention right now, instead of what creates the best long-term outcome. This is why exhausted leaders often micromanage, overreact, create unnecessary urgency, struggle to delegate, make emotionally driven decisions, constantly pivot priorities, and lose clarity on long-term vision. Their cognition becomes trapped in tactical survival. Urgency replacing clarity is one of the clearest signs of cognitive overload. This is when urgency starts replacing discernment. Everything feels important, immediate, high pressure, and emotionally charged. The leader loses the ability to differentiate between critical versus non-critical, signal versus noise, distraction and true emergencies versus manufactured urgency. This creates what many organizations normalize as high performance, but it is actually high functioning dysregulation. The organization becomes addicted to constant responsiveness, rapid fire communication, perpetual acceleration, over-meeting, and overstimulation. Meanwhile, strategic thinking disappears because clarity requires cognitive space, recovery, attentional control, emotional regulation, and uninterrupted thinking time. And chronic urgency destroys all of that. The brain under stress narrows attention toward immediate threats. That may help survival temporarily, but it weakens innovation, pattern recognition, nuanced thinking systems, thinking, creativity, and long-term planning. Cognitive narrowing is one of the most dangerous effects of chronic stress and physiological depletion. Under stress, the brain conserves energy by simplifying perception. The leader becomes less able to see complexity clearly, evaluate multiple perspectives, tolerate uncertainty, think expansively, and process subtle information. The leader's thinking becomes rigid, binary, emotionally biased, threat-focused, and overly simplistic. That is neurologically protective in survival states, but it is dangerous in leadership because modern leadership requires adaptive thinking, emotional intelligence, strategic patience, pattern recognition, and cognitive flexibility. When cognition narrows, leaders start solving complex problems with survival-based thinking. Some examples are cutting instead of rebuilding, controlling instead of developing, reacting instead of assessing, escalating instead of regulating, overworking instead of recovering, and forcing instead of strategizing. From the outside, the leader may still appear highly functional, but internally, decision quality is declining. The hidden organizational risks most organizations assess are financial, the market risks, operational risks, and legal risks. Very few assess executive cognitive risk. Yet impaired decision-making at the leadership level can quietly damage culture, retention, innovation, execution, morale, financial outcomes, and strategic direction. This is why protecting executive physiology is not wellness. It is risk mitigation. It is leadership infrastructure because every strategy flows through cognition. Every culture flows through leadership behavior, and every decision flows through nervous system capacity, and no organization can sustainably outperform the physiological condition of its leadership forever. The greatest threat to leadership performance is not lack of intelligence. It is prolonged operation at reduced cognitive capacity. One of the biggest problems in leadership culture is that reduced capacity often hides behind competence. People can still appear functional long after their cognition has started declining. That's why I created the Signal framework, not as another productivity tool, but as a quick executive audit to identify early signs of physiological and cognitive overload before it turns into burnout, poor decision-making, emotional reactivity, strategic drift, and health collapse. Because the earlier leaders recognize reduced capacity, the earlier they can intervene. Let's get into this framework. S is sleep quality, not just how long you sleep, how restored your brain actually is. A leader may technically get 6 to 7 hours of sleep, but still wake up mentally foggy, emotionally reactive, exhausted, and dependent on caffeine to function. That's me. This happened to me recently, and I know I'm not the only person this happens to. The other night, I slept 7 hours, but I woke up 3 times thinking about problems, checked my phone at 2 a.m., and when I woke up a few hours later, I was mentally behind before the day even started. I have mentioned in the past videos that my sleep and my nighttime routine is still a challenge. Okay, don't judge me. Pray for me. So many leaders, like myself, may still attend meetings, answer emails, perform publicly, but cognitively, we are already operating below baseline. The brain never fully completed recovery, so the day starts from depletion instead of restoration. I, interruptions and cognitive fragmentation. Your brain cannot produce strategic thought in a constant state of interruption. Modern leadership environments create continuous attentional fragmentation. We got Slack notifications, texts, emails, meetings, calls, social media, and constant accessibility. Every interruption forces the brain to task switch, and task switching is metabolically expensive. There was a leader I worked with. She sat down to work on a strategic project for 1 hour, but during that hour, she checked her email 6 times, answered 3 texts, responded to Slack messages, took 2 calls, and never actually entered deep thought. At the end of the day, she said to me she felt busy, but was mentally exhausted and overstimulated, and nothing cognitively meaningful moved forward that day. That is cognitive fragmentation. And over time, it destroys clarity, creativity, decision quality, and executive thinking. G, gut check on your decision fatigue. How many high quality decisions can your brain realistically sustain today? I still struggle with this because I still am attached to my calendar, attached to dashboards. And if I'm being honest, right now I'm actually creating a dashboard calendar KPI all in one with ChatGPT and Claude. Crazy, but that's just how my brain works. So I've been recently gut checking myself and asking myself, how often can you do this? So now I break it down into phases. I have a certain time that I do recording videos, then I stop. I have a certain time that I create script content, then I stop. I have certain times that I work on my medical things because I'm actually back in school, then I stop. Because if I continue, the decision fatigue, which is always subtle at first, it shows up as avoidance, indecision, irritability, impulsive choices, and overthinking simple tasks. There is substantial research around decision fatigue, cognitive depletion, and reduced executive function under prolonged mental demand, especially in psychology, behavioral economics, medicine, and judicial decision-making research. So one of the most widely cited examples is this judicial parole study by researchers, and I'm probably going to butcher these names. Apologies. Shai Danziger, Jonathan Levov, and 𝗬𝗓𝗪, published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. This famous research is the Judges Study, and the researchers analyzed over 1,100 parole decisions made by experienced Israeli judges. What they discovered was startling. At the beginning of the day or shortly after food breaks, judges were significantly more likely to grant parole. But as the sessions progressed and mental fatigue accumulated, favorable rulings steadily declined. Judges increasingly defaulted to denial. Decision quality became more conservative and cognitively simplified. The approval rate reportedly dropped from around 65% after breaks to nearly 0%, to none. No paroles were granted before the next break. Then after rest and food, the approval rates abruptly rose again. You're probably wondering why this matters. These were not inexperienced people. These were highly trained legal professionals making decisions with enormous consequences. The findings suggest that mental depletion affects even elite cognitive performers. As cognitive fatigue increases, the brain begins conserving energy. And when the brain conserves energy, it prefers default options, safer options, and less cognitively demanding decisions. In the judge's case, the default was denying parole, not necessarily because it was the best decision, but because it required less cognitive risk. This directly applies to leadership. As leaders become cognitively depleted, they often begin avoiding complexity, delaying difficult conversations, and defaulting to familiar strategies. This is why exhausted leaders often micromanage, become rigid, struggle with innovation, and lose patience. The brain under fatigue prioritizes efficiency over depth. Even judges making life-altering decisions became more reactive and cognitively simplified as mental fatigue increased. If cognitive depletion affects trained judges, it absolutely affects leaders, executives, healthcare providers, and entrepreneurs. The N, the non-negotiable thinking time. Ooh. If every moment is consumed, strategic thinking disappears. Most leaders schedule meetings, deadlines, deliverables, and obligations, but never schedule uninterrupted thinking. And without thinking space, leaders become permanently reactive. This is why my morning routine, even though it is an optimization hack, but it is one that is so important because I pray and I meditate and I quiet my mind. It is so important. I put non-negotiable thinking times into my schedule on purpose. So instead of leading strategically, anticipating problems, and creating vision, most leaders spend the day responding, reacting, and putting out fires. You don't want to be a firefighter in your own life and in your business. Strategic thinking requires protected cognitive space. Without it, urgency takes over the calendar. A, autonomy over calendar. If your calendar controls you, your nervous system eventually pays for it. Many leaders have calendars that reflect everyone else's priorities. I was horrible for this. And especially being an entrepreneur, a nurse, and a mom, especially when you have underage kids, everybody's priority comes before yours. And I've learned to reverse that. I am at the top of the pyramid. My priorities come first. And then I'll get to your needs. And then if I have some bandwidth, I might oblige you a want. So when leaders' calendars reflect everyone else's priorities, their own and not their own physiological capacity, you get back-to-back scheduling, which creates cortisol elevation, attentional fatigue, emotional exhaustion, and reduced recovery opportunities. Working in high acuity environments, I would look at the clock and realize that from 7 a.m. to 7 p.m., I did not take a single break to eat properly, decompress, think, or mentally reset. Towards the end of my shift, my patience declined, my clarity decreased, and my emotional regulation was almost gone. None of this is good when mistakes could lead to catastrophic or fatal results. This is also synonymous in high-stakes corporate environments also. The leader becomes increasingly reactive because the nervous system never had space to recover between demands. Autonomy over time is not laziness. It is cognitive preservation. Now, L, longevity risk if nothing changes. What happens if you continue operating like this for 5 or 10 years? Because I know I was doing it in around year 18 is when I realized I could not function like this anymore. I was clearly 200 pounds overweight. I was burnt out. My marriage was unstable. I was helping my daughter through college. And that was a question I had to ask myself. And unfortunately, medically, if I did not change, 10 years the solution would have been a RIP on a t-shirt. This is a question that most people avoid because high achievers normalize dysfunction when performance still appears intact, but physiology keeps the score. Before I got into this work, into executive longevity, the intensive care units is where I would first meet executives who ignored the signs while their body was still keeping the score. Some admitted they realized their blood pressure was climbing, their sleep was worsening, and their body felt inflamed, but they kept telling themselves, I just need to push through this season. I need to push through this quarter. But the season never ended and one quarter ran into the next. But eventually, their body forced what the mind ignored, what the schedule denied, and what the nervous system could no longer sustain. This is why longevity is not simply about lifespan. It is about preserving cognition, vitality, emotional regulation, leadership clarity, and quality of life for the long term. The most dangerous part of reduced capacity is that many leaders don't notice it until dysfunction becomes normalized. And by then, they've mistaken survival mode for leadership. A leadership that sometimes pauses or jumps to an unplanned succession. What is the new leadership advantage? For years, leadership culture rewarded exhaustion, overextension, and constant availability. The leader who slept the least, worked the longest, and tolerated the most stress was often perceived as the most committed. But we are entering a different era now. Because complexity has increased, the volume of information, decisions, interruptions, and organizational pressure has exceeded what human cognition can sustainably process without recovery. And because of that, the new leadership advantage is no longer simply intelligence, charisma, productivity, and hustle. The new advantage is physiological stability under pressure. The leaders who will sustain high performance long-term are the ones who can regulate their nervous system, recover efficiently, maintain clarity under complexity, think strategically under stress, and remain emotionally steady during uncertainty. In other words, the future belongs to the regulated leaders. Most people think leadership is purely psychological, but leadership is deeply physiological. Every conversation, negotiation, decision, conflict, and crisis is filtered through the nervous system first. If the nervous system perceives threat, the body shifts into survival prioritization. This affects emotional regulation, cognition, reaction speed, and decision quality. A dysregulated leader often interrupts more, reacts emotionally, escalates tension, and creates urgency unnecessarily. Not necessarily because they lack skill, but because their physiology is overloaded. Meanwhile, regulated leaders can pause before reacting, remain composed under stress, tolerate ambiguity, think strategically during pressure, and stabilize the emotional tone of the room. And that matters because nervous systems are contagious. Teams often mirror the physiology of leadership. An anxious leader creates organizational anxiety. A reactive leader creates organizational instability. A regulated leader creates psychological safety and clarity. This is why nervous system regulation is not soft. It directly affects communication, quality, culture, trust, retention, decision-making, and execution. Most people treat recovery as optional. Elite performers treat recovery as infrastructure. That is a massive distinction. Recovery is not laziness, weakness, disengagement, or lack of ambition. Recovery is what allows sustained output without cognitive collapse. The brain and body were designed to oscillate between stress, recovery, and adaptation, but many leaders stay in continuous activation. Eventually, creativity declines, cognition narrows, and performance becomes inconsistent. Recovery systems intentionally interrupt that cycle. These systems include sleep protection, movement, sunlight exposure, strategic pauses, thinking walks, deep work boundaries, emotional processing, intentional stillness, reduced cognitive clutter, calendar spacing, and nervous system downregulation. The goal is not to avoid stress. The goal is to build enough recovery capacity to metabolize stress efficiently, because sustainable leadership is not built through endless exertion. It is built through strategic recovery. Most people can perform intensely for short periods. The real question is, can they sustain clarity, health, cognition, and emotional regulation over decades? That is sustainable performance. Many high achievers unknowingly build success on top of adrenal activation, chronic cortisol elevation, sleep deprivation, emotional suppression, and nervous system dysregulation. And initially, it works until it doesn't. Eventually, the body begins sending signals like fatigue, irritability, insomnia, brain fog, inflammation, emotional numbness, reduced motivation, and declining resilience. The mistake many leaders make is trying to push harder through physiological depletion. But long-term high performance is not built through chronic override. It is built through stability. Sustainable performers understand rest improves decision quality, recovery improves creativity, emotional regulation improves leadership, clarity improves execution, and boundaries preserve cognition. The highest performing leaders are often not the busiest people in the room. They are the people most intentional about protecting their capacity. One of the most underrated leadership skills is emotional steadiness. Not emotional suppression, steadiness. Because organizations take emotional cues from leadership. In uncertain environments, people are constantly scanning leaders for safety, direction, confidence, and stability. A reactive leader amplifies chaos. A steady leader reduces unnecessary threat signaling. Emotional steadiness allows leaders to respond instead of react, tolerate pressure without collapse, navigate conflict calmly, maintain perspective under stress, and prevent emotional contagion from spreading through teams. This becomes critically important during organizational transitions, financial uncertainty, conflicts, scaling pressure, and crisis management. Because under stress, people do not just remember what leaders said. They remember how leaders regulated themselves, how safe they felt, and whether leadership created clarity or confusion. Steadiness is a leadership stabilizer. Modern leadership is not difficult because leaders lack information. It is difficult because leaders are drowning in information. The challenge is no longer access. The challenge is discernment, and discernment requires cognitive clarity. The best leaders are not necessarily the fastest thinkers. They are often the clearest thinkers. Clarity under complexity means filtering signal from noise, resisting emotional reactivity, maintaining long-term perspective, seeing patterns accurately, and remaining strategic during uncertainty. But clarity cannot emerge from constant overstimulation. Clarity requires mental space, recovery regulation, attentional control, and reduced cognitive fragmentation. This is why regulated leaders often appear calmer, not because they have fewer problems, but because their cognition remains accessible under pressure. The next era of leadership will not belong to the most exhausted person in the room. It will belong to the leader who can maintain clarity, regulation, and strategic thinking in a world designed to fragment attention and overload the nervous system. In the next era of leadership, regulated leaders will outperform reactive ones. Exhaustion is not proof of importance, and burnout is not a badge of leadership. The leaders who scale sustainably will be the leaders who learn how to protect decision quality before it declines. I want to leave you with something to ponder this week. What patterns in your current leadership style are actually signals of physiological overload? And what would change in your decisions, relationships, and performance if you prioritize recovery as seriously as you prioritize productivity? I'm going to repeat those questions one more time. What patterns in your current leadership style are actually signals of physiological overload? And what would change in your decisions, relationships, and performance if you prioritize recovery as seriously as you prioritize productivity. If this episode helped you think differently about leadership and longevity, consider sharing it with another leader who might benefit from the conversation. Before we wrap up, take a moment to reflect on what stood out most in today's conversation. Leadership performance isn't built in dramatic moments. It's shaped by the small systems you practice every day. If today's episode resonated with you, you'll find several resources in the show notes to help you go deeper. That includes the Executive Capacity Audit, which helps leaders evaluate the biological and cognitive factors influencing their performance. You'll also find the waitlist for the Strategic Longevity Collective, where I work directly with leaders who want to protect their decision quality, resilience, and long-term leadership capacity. And if you haven't already followed the show, what are you waiting for? Follow me so you don't miss future episodes. Until next time, protect your energy, protect your clarity, and lead for the long term.